Welcome, everybody. This is Avoiding the Addiction Affliction, brought to you by Westwards Consulting and the Kenosha County Substance Abuse Coalition. I'm Mike McGowan. A few months ago, I had the privilege of speaking with our guest today, KJ Aiello, about mental illness and the stigma around that term. KJ is a Toronto-based mentally ill writer whose work includes essays, op-eds, and a soon-to-be-released fall of 2024 nonfiction book titled The Monster and the Mirror, which explores the intersection of speculative fiction and mental illness. She also authored a brilliant article titled Who Gets to Be Mentally Ill that we talked about last time. So go back and listen to that. Well, as oftentimes happens, since we've last chatted, a couple of things have come up. Welcome back, KJ.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I was so glad to get your email being invited back. It was a
Oh,
great conversation we had last time.
yeah, I loved it. We had a lot of positive response to it. Since we last talked, okay, I'm just going to go off the news stuff, right?
Okay.
Your country
Mhm.
has a law called the Medical Assistance in Dying Law. Let's just start there.
Yes.
What is
Yeah.
that?
So the medical assistance in dying law, or the MAID law, is a legislation that actually allows medical practitioners to provide assistance in dying for folks. And I don't know the exact language, but basically folks who the life condition is basically unlivable. Death is foreseeable. A lot of folks with chronic illnesses that they're going downhill basically, and they want to die with dignity. And this is the whole premise around it, is being able to die with dignity. Now, that was initially came about because of a case called Carter versus Canada. And I think that was a 2016. The decision I think was in 2016. But from that case, then sprung this whole issue of it excluded folks with mental illness, solely with mental illness. And then from that case, people started, decrying it, saying that, well, you're actually removing human rights from folks with mental illness if you exclude just them, right? And you think about it too, dying with dignity it's enshrined in our Constitution, in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Basically, Section 7 says that we have the right to live. We have life, liberty, and security of the person. Basically, we have autonomy over what happens to our own bodies, right? And the ability to
Mhm.
be able to die with dignity should be our choice, which makes sense. If you think of it theoretically on paper, it looks good. However, there
Right.
are a lot of issues.
Well, and so I know that was tabled once before, but
Mhm,
scheduled, right? Or
mhm.
what was just passed, scheduled to be enacted in March of 2024.
Yeah.
Somebody whose sole condition is mental illness
Mhm.
will be allowed to access that law. And that
Right.
includes substance use disorders.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you sent me that article, that a Vice article
Mhm.
actually, and I thought the title I think was something about Canada will allow folks with, addictions to be able to access this legislation. And I do think that that is a little bit of a clickbaity title, in
Mhm.
that folks with addictions as well, like the addiction, substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, it's in the DSM. So folks living with addiction, by extension, by proxy, I think that's the proper term for it, will be allowed this as well with solely addiction. Now, it's been tabled a couple of times, this legislation, simply because there are so many compounding factors when we think about made legislation for folks simply with only with mental illness. I have
You
to edit
you
that.
talked about this. You went through your own stuff, right?
Hmm.
Let's just break it down. How would it be determined? Who's to determine that you're eligible? Is it the
Right.
individual panel, doctors, one doctor?
Yeah, so I think there's supposed to be two medical health professionals who will do an analysis, an assessment of the individual who applies for it. It's the individual has to be of awareness, self-determination. They have to know what they're signing up for, basically. And then two mental health professionals will be assessing them. And I think that it's a 90-day wait period. And that is also included in the assessment period. So if the individual who is suffering, if they actually have a turn of events, or they change their mind, that there is that 90-day grace period. One of the very first issues when you think of that is a 90-day wait period. So my question is, why should somebody who does want to die with dignity, whose sole diagnosis is mental illness only have to wait 90 days to access this, when people who actually want to get help have to wait upwards to a year and a half to get a proper psychiatric assessment, let alone start a course of treatment that may or may not work.
Okay, okay, you're ahead of me. That's exactly why I called you back.
Yeah,
That's the part that I don't get, is the wait would be
yeah.
shorter to
Mhm.
get medical assistance to die than it is to get help.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see this is one of the reasons I think that this is first of all, it's such a contentious issue, and secondly, I personally don't believe it will come into act in March of 2024, because this is will be the third time it's been tabled, right? Um, there are if we're going to have a conversation about MAID for folks with only mental illness, we have to have in tandem a conversation about access to treatment, about a living wage, about
Right.
all of the other factors that actually go into somebody's mental health condition, right? We have, folks who are living with intergenerational trauma who have never received any kind of compensation or reparations. Our indigenous folks are basically watching their history being dug up in Canada with, the children, the graves, the mass graves that we're finding. How can we possibly say that MAID should come before folks who are living with that intergenerational trauma, with that history of trauma? How can we possibly say that, yes, MAID is a good idea, which in theory, I actually believe it is a good idea. It is our human right to be able to die with dignity. But how can we have that conversation if we are not also talking about the fact that folks with disabilities are living far below a living wage? They are living in poverty. They cannot get gainful employment because of lack of accessibility at work. We're talking about stigma at work. I get so worked up about it, Mike.
Yeah.
It feels like such an impossible situation. And, if we're talking about, made for folks with mental illness, we have to have these other conversations at the very same time,
Well,
right?
and it's been argued, right, that
Yeah.
people like the homeless or those with less resources or
Yeah.
those who are incarcerated might opt for termination. And then what does that say about society in
Yeah.
general?
Yeah.
Who's accessing it? Is it euthanasia for those of us who are disadvantaged, or
Yeah.
uh,
That is one of the big questions, and I think it was the not the Mental Health Commission of Canada, but the Canadian Mental Health Association, I believe, sent out a report, and I'm not entirely sure it was them. It was one of our associations here that basically raised that exact same issue, that would these folks with mental illness or addictions be accessing MAID simply because they want help, but they can't get it, right? Or even if they can get help, treatment's not working. I
mhm.
think it's 40% of folks living with unipolar depression, which is major depressive disorder, no treatment works. So they are technically considered treatment resistant.
Well,
Yeah.
no treatment works yet.
Yet,
I mean,
yet,
that's one of the
yeah.
questions I was going to ask you, is who knows what's around the corner? I think the last time we talked,
Mhm.
you were misdiagnosed,
Mhm.
undiagnosed for a long time, correct?
Yeah, yeah, that is correct. I have bipolar type 2, which means that for folks with bipolar type 2, they're misdiagnosed considerably more times than folks with bipolar type 1, because with type 1, they usually present to a mental health care facility or the hospital with symptoms of mania. And it's pretty obvious when you see somebody who is having a manic episode or a psychotic episode that they're going to get mental health care treatment. Hopefully, one would hope. But folks with bipolar disorder type 2, the primary presentation is actually depression. And
Hmm.
it's usually suicidality, which is what happened with me as I went into the ER because I attempted suicide. And so, if you're not actually careful, if you not do your due diligence, if you have a 15-minute psychiatric evaluation, as I did, 20 years ago, then you get diagnosed with unipolar depression, so major depressive disorder, and then you're put on the wrong medication that actually makes you worse, right? So it's not that we don't have the resources or the knowledge or the wherewithal to be able to do this. What we don't have is, in my case, was the patience. I
Hmm.
saw a psychiatrist for 15 minutes. That's not acceptable. And even now, when I was diagnosed properly in 2015 with bipolar disorder, my evaluation was 45 minutes. Now, I had the wherewithal, I had insight and information. I had been doing so much research on bipolar disorder because I suspected that was actually what I had. So I was able to communicate that information to the psychiatrist. And it was more of a dialogue rather than, peppering me with questions and then making a decision for me without, my consent or my input, right? So, like I do think the way we diagnose mental illness is very much it's like a crapshoot sometimes. It really is.
Right.
It's a crapshoot. There is no, biological test that we can do yet, although we are coming closer to being able to have a biological, a blood test, that sort of thing. But this also means that, to be honest, a lot of our treatments are psychopharmaceuticals, are, ECT, which is still used today, and it's actually not invasive at all. It can be very helpful. In psychotherapies, we actually don't know the modality in which they work. We don't know the physiological impacts that these treatments have. We don't know because we don't know what is actually causing these on a neurophysiological and a biological level. We don't know what is happening in our bodies and in our brains when somebody has bipolar disorder. We have,
Well,
some sense, but how can you treat something you don't really know what's causing it?
and then how do you make the decision that this is incurable?
Exactly, exactly. All we have is what we've seen in the past. And folks, with my condition, bipolar disorder, the prognosis, if they're treated early enough, is usually pretty good. Bipolar disorder type 2, you can have some semblance of a normal, quote unquote, normal life, but there are still significant limitations to that. Right. And if you don't, the individual doesn't have the resources. Thankfully, I live in such a privileged position where I do have resources to be able to manage my mental health. I don't have to work a full-time job. I am able to take time off or, to cancel or postpone appointments.
Right.
I can do these things without hardly any repercussions, which if I didn't have those resources, that ability in my own personal life, I'm not sure where I would be today,
Well,
but
you've written that the problem isn't this law,
yeah,
it's the system in which it works, right?
exactly, exactly. And, I'm not at the decision table here with respect to this law. I'm not on, panels and that sort of thing. So I don't know the kind of conversations that are being had by the policymakers, by the psychiatrists, by these, panelists. I don't know the specific conversations. And it's quite possible that they are talking about this. But, from my vantage point and from the vantage point of a lot of folks living with disability, and yes, mental illness is a disability. And that's another problem, is that a lot of times we don't consider it a disability, is that we're not having these two conversations in tandem. We are not addressing the underlying issues that actually for a lot of folks end up leading to mental illness. If you remove all of the other factors from their lives, if you, give them a living wage, if you give them gainful employment or at least some sort of an occupation that is meaningful, if you allow them their voice, allow them to be seen, if you, folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, if we address systemic oppression and racism as well, how many folks would be struggling? How many folks would be, living with substance use disorder? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking idyllically here, but I have a feeling it might be a little bit better than our current situation.
Yeah.
So,
You know, in America here, we have the ADA, American for Disability Act, right?
yeah,
Which
yeah.
requires that public buildings, let's just use one example, have a way to access that building. So you build a ramp
Hmm.
for those people who need a
Hmm.
ramp, right?
Hmm.
Well, last week we were going to do this conversation and you very nicely just emailed me and said, can we postpone it? I'm
Hmm.
having some mental health issues, which is what you're saying, right? You need to have that same freedom for this condition as somebody with a more visible condition
Yeah.
also has.
Absolutely, and I think we have something very similar here. It's the see, I'm drawing blanks this morning, Mike. It's so gray and crusty out that my brain is actually very foggy. So
Uh,
I'm losing words.
yeah, get
Um,
used to it. This ends
yeah,
in May, I think, right?
call me in May.
Yeah.
Um, we do have similar legislation here that, I mean, air quotes here, protects folks living with disability, and that should include folks living with mental illness. The problem is that a lot of employers don't really know how to address accessibility when it comes to mental illness. And a lot of employers, quite frankly, they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to because folks with mental illness are perceived usually pretty negatively, and particularly folks living with substance use disorder.
Hmm.
Let's be real, like folks with substance use disorder, they really struggle to find employment. So I tend to think that, in the employment world, employers don't want to have to deal with this because it's too difficult to be able to figure out, okay, our employee who, on paper could be a model employee, lives with bipolar disorder. She needs to call in, quote unquote, sick quite often. How can we work around that so that she is able to do what she needs to do and still be mentally well and we can get the work done, right?
Right. My other question regarding the substance use disorder is how
Mhm,
would you possibly
mhm,
use this law with
mhm.
somebody whose brain and body
Yeah.
is full of chemicals? I mean, wouldn't you want the chemicals out of the body before you assessed what their condition actually was?
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think that, one of the big problems with that is that, particularly with alcohol abuse, is that a lot of folks actually can't, quit, again, quote unquote, quit alcohol because it could be lethal.
Hmm.
Right. So they need so many medical resources. And I don't know particularly the drug that's, or, series of drugs that are used to be able to help folks who live with alcohol use disorder. Um, but if you're living with substance use disorder, how can you possibly access these resources, particularly in the US, where, you don't have free healthcare? And even here in Canada, our healthcare, which, quote unquote, is free, we do pay heavy taxes, so it's not technically free. There are so many treatments that are not available, quote unquote, free, that are related to mental health care. We can't get therapy is not covered. Most of our prescriptions are not covered, right? If we need long-term substance use healthcare, if we need to go into rehab, any kind of treatment facility, part of that is not covered. So if you have somebody living with a mental illness so serious that they're unable to work, and that includes substance use disorder, how are they possibly going to pay for this? How are they
Hmm.
possibly going to be able to pay for private healthcare insurance? It's just, it's baffling. And the thing is that this feeds into a system of oppression, of poverty, of, systemic stigma, right? Because we're not seeing these folks living productive lives. So then we assume that they can't, which is not the case. It's the system in which we work that has failed these folks. I get really worked up about this, Mike, as you can tell.
Well, I used to, but my job before I started doing prevention was to run a hospital. And
Yeah,
here we changed the laws so that we put people in charge, the money people in charge. We used to, in
yeah,
Wisconsin, where I live, we used to mandate the amount you could charge for a 30-day treatment stay. And then we took that
mhm,
out of the equation, and immediately companies decided to charge more, and then insurance companies said, we're not covering it.
yeah,
So all of those places that used to be open for treatment closed, mine included. And
yeah,
so that doesn't mean that people stop drinking or using drugs or
mhm,
having mental health issues. In fact,
mhm,
we're seeing more of that now. Right, right.
yeah,
We're
yeah,
both doing thumbs up for those of you listening. And where do you go for help? That's
yeah.
part of it. That's part of it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly. And folks, particularly with substance use disorder, are stigmatized even more in the healthcare system than anybody else. When I was doing research for my book, I actually came across I can't remember this specific statistics, but folks with substance use disorder are stigmatized so egregiously in the healthcare system that they actually cannot receive the healthcare for their substance use disorder than they need. So it's an Ouroboros, right? This is just, and we're in destruction zone right now, particularly, coming out of a pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, where usage went up and depression went up. I did
Yeah,
a conversation yesterday where we're close to you, right? We're just across the
yeah,
lake from you.
yeah,
And we have a state where we have more women drinking excessively than any other state in the country. And
yeah,
it almost exactly mirrors the depression statistics for that same demographic.
yeah.
So what a shock that a
I
depressant
know.
drug would add to your depression. And
Shock.
well, but that's part of it with the panel. I can't wait to see how this turns out because
Hmm.
there are so many different branches on this tree that I'd love to
Hmm.
just ask a bunch of questions and see who can answer them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know that there's a couple of folks in my wheelhouse who are definitely keeping their eye on this whole legislation. I have my doubts that it actually
Yeah,
will
yeah.
come into an action in March of 2024. It was supposed to be this past March, and then it was supposed to be in, I think, June of 2020 or 2021. I can't remember, but which tells me that people are recognizing that there's other issues that they just feel too big to address. They're just so big. How can you move a leviathan that is the size of our systemic inequities to be able to allow folks with mental illness and substance use disorder the access to resources they need in order to be able to live fulfilling lives so that they won't actually be considering MAID.
Yeah.
I
Well,
said,
let's talk for a minute, if you don't mind, about
Mhm.
your own diagnosis. And how can you do that, or is it okay to
Yeah.
ask you
Oh,
how
yeah.
you're being treated?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my treatment, I'm on lamotrigine. I have tried other medications, but I just find that the side effects are too much for me. I do have a therapist, which sometimes I can't see her because I have to pay for it out of pocket, and therapy
Hmm.
is really expensive. It's mostly my lifestyle that actually helps me. I have a partner who's incredibly compassionate. His brother lives with bipolar type 1. He's autistic and he has a significant intellectual disability. So, my husband looks after him. My husband knows what this looks like. And I live in, a safe home, a safe environment with also friends who understand. And I said to you last time, I'm at the point where if somebody wants to judge me because I'm having a mental health challenge or even a mental health crisis, because I can't guarantee I won't have a crisis in the future. If somebody wants to judge me for that, then that's on them.
Hmm.
Read the room. We're past that now. Pardon my bitterness there. I don't know if it's bitterness, but it's more of cynicism. I'm cynical now. After 20 years of this, I feel a little cynical, but it's just before the pandemic, during the pandemic as well, was very difficult for my mental health. And I actually learned about the MAID legislation. It was the middle of the night when I was actually contemplating. I didn't have an action for suicide, but I had been seriously starting to put a bit of a plan together. Then I was doing some Googling and I came across MAID. And then that just, I went down a rabbit hole, which probably distracted me from my feelings of suicidality into action about this legislation that I had no idea anything about. So, I mean, I laugh, but it's so strange sometimes how things work like that.
Well,
But
so
yeah,
the government saved your life.
don't tell them that though. It's the government's failings that saved my life.
There you go. There you go.
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
So you don't think that let me wrap this up for you. You don't
Yeah.
think that you think it'll be tabled again, but how do you think it will be tabled? Who will be the voice that is listened to the
Mm.
most?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I do find that folks with lived experience are being listened to more now, but at the end of and they're being invited to the decision table, which I really appreciate. But at the end of the day, it is going to be, the psychiatrists, the policymakers, the analysts who don't have lived experience. They're basically taking this information, taking these stories, these narratives from folks with lived experience, and they're making their objective analytical decisions. And that's, therein also lies the problem with our diagnostic tools. The DSM is it's categorical. It basically, do you meet a threshold or do you not? Well, what if you're just below the threshold? How can you possibly be diagnosed and then treated appropriately?
Mhm.
And this is the same thing. And I try not to let my feelings get in the way of that, but I tend to become a little bit cynical about that. And I do believe that there are still some sentiments that folks with mental illness, particularly folks with serious mental illness and substance use disorder, are not taken seriously. There is gaslighting in the system. So I don't know what it's going to look like, but I definitely hope that they're going to be speaking to more folks with lived experience and our voices are going to be heard more by the public.
Well, we'll send this podcast right to Parliament and
Please do. I'm going to send it to my MP and MPP and everybody else I know.
that's
Yeah.
great. Well, when KJ's book comes out, we're going to have her back on, if not before that, just to talk about it when I can read it.
Yeah.
And just thanks a lot for having this discussion with us today. Because when I read the article, I'm like, I got a million questions and I know who to ask.
I
So,
love it. Thank you. I
yeah,
appreciate it, Mike. And again, it's always such a pleasure. And thank you for doing all the
yeah,
hard work that you do.
uh,
It's great to see this. It really is.
yeah. Thanks a bunch. And
Yeah.
there's links to KJ's work. And hey, connect with them. The articles and blogs and writings are spectacular. So they are listed at the end of this website. And listen in next time. And until next time, stay safe and get involved.